Hello and welcome everyone to our first session led by NBC Universal News Group, which I'm really looking forward to. You'll get the opportunity to hear from journalists on how they call out misinformation for what it is, but without being perceived as biased or possibly losing the public's trust. My name is Alexa Bolland. I'm the Senior Manager of Educator Professional Learning at the News Literacy Project, and I'm joined today by some other NLP folks who are behind the scenes. They're going to be dropping some helpful links and resources in the chat to help you translate all of this amazing expertise into some classroom learning. Just a couple of really frequently asked questions. Yes, this session will be recorded and you will have access to it as well as all of the other presentations and the resources that we're going to be dropping, all of which are free, and we will send those to you in an email early to mid next week. At the end of the NewsLitCamp, there will be a feedback survey. For those of you who have requested a certificate of attendance, you can access it there. And again, for questions for the panelists, we want to keep those all in one place. So please use the Q&A feature. And then for just general comments about applying all of this knowledge into the classroom, let's keep that all focused in the chat. Now I'm going to turn things over to our moderator, MSNBC host Ali Velshi, who you might know from the weekend morning show Velshi. Previously, he was the anchor for MSNBC Live, and over his career has covered a wide range of domestic, global, and economic issues, from climate change to tensions with Russia. Ali, and to all of the panelists, welcome. We are so excited to have you join us. I'm going to go camera off now and excited to hear this conversation.
Alexa, thank you. And thank you to the NewsLit Project and NBCU Academy, celebrating its second anniversary, by the way. So thanks for doing this. Thanks to all of you who are attending. First of all, I just love your etiquette, which is much better than ours in the news business. Everybody in the webinar chat saying hi and where they're from. So I love seeing where everybody's from around the country and from places not in the country. And I see there's already one question in the Q&A, which I love. We don't want to do this as a panel and then a bunch of questions at the end. Send your questions in as you're hearing this conversation, and we're going to just make this a very loose conversation, which is great because everybody that I've got here is sort of a friend and colleague of mine. As Alexa said, I'm Ali Velshi. I host a show called Velshi on MSNBC every Saturday and Sunday morning. I also host The Last Word on Friday nights at 10 p.m. I'm out in the field a lot. I have this amazing job in which I'm a host of a show, and that gives me a lot of sort of space to interview people and tell the stories I want to tell. And I'm primarily a reporter. I like some of our other panelists here, like Amna, like Hallie, and like Brandy. We're reporters. We're either out in the field or we're following stories and trying to get those kinds of things to you. So the plan now is for the next 3 hours. This is just for the next hour, but NBCU Academy is teaming up with the News Literacy Project to host 3 important discussions and answer your questions. We're trying to pull the curtain back a little bit to help you and the people you talk to understand what we do to get the story. You all see the end result of our stories, and I think I've always been of the mind that if everybody saw more of what we do and a bit more of the process and understood our thought processes, it would help our legitimacy. And of course, I thought this before I realized that, legitimacy of the news media continues to suffer. So here at NBC News, at MSNBC, at CNBC, at Telemundo, at all the various properties we have, one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that we have a similar process across all of those platforms. Our standards are supposed to be as high across all of those platforms, and we're going to have that discussion as well. NBCU Academy, I just want to put in a plug here. It's a journalism and media training program that helps students and young professionals learn skills that they need to grow their careers. This is, as I said, the 2-year anniversary. You can go to NBCUacademy.com to learn more about it. But I want to kick off this conversation. It's about misinformation and falsehoods, and how, as Alexa said, we call those things out while allowing you to trust us. Alexa used the expression without bias, and I actually want to discuss that a little bit with my panelists, because I wonder about that a little bit. I have biases about a lot of things, as do all of you and as do a lot of your viewers. And I don't know whether it's best to not have that in the news or to make sure you know what mine is. And I say that because when I cover a hurricane, I have a bias that that's bad and the damage that it does are bad. When I capture when I cover a killing, I have, or when somebody's lying to me, I have a bias against that. I think it's bad. But how do I not make you think that this is my agenda, my screed? Those are the kind of questions that we're going to discuss. I want to launch right into it. My great buddy, Hallie Jackson, is with us here. And Hallie and I are great friends. She started at NBC before I did, so she's been sort of a trusted mentor and somebody I can run things by, and she's really been great to me. She's had a lot of jobs here. She's a senior Washington correspondent. She was the chief White House correspondent. She's an anchor for NBC News NOW and MSNBC. She has kind of done all of it. And in terms of holding people to account, she's had to do that, particularly at the White House and with the administration. So I'm really, really happy to have my buddy Hallie with me. Another one of my great friends who I've spent a lot of time on TV with is Brandy Zadrozny. She's an investigative journalist. She's a senior reporter with NBC News. She covers I actually describe it on TV as Brandy sort of lives in the gross underbelly of the internet. She covers misinformation and extremism she covers stuff that's I wouldn't be able to sleep at night. She was a fellow at the Harvard Shorenstein Center, and I think most importantly, Brandy Zadrozny used to be a librarian. And that's something that has always been close to my heart, but it's uniquely close to my heart in this era of book banning and the fact that librarians, I didn't know librarians were going to be on the front line between us and democracy and liberty and freedom, but they are librarians and teachers. And I think that's the bulk of who we've got here in our audience. Chris Scholl is joining us, and that makes me really happy because some of my most interesting conversations at my time at NBC have been with Chris. He's the senior vice president of standards for NBC News. He himself is an award-winning investigative journalist and producer. And we have remarkable, hearty conversations. And more than once, I've said to Chris in the middle of those conversations, which they're not really arguments. I think I'll ask Chris about it. I don't think they're arguments. But in those conversations, I've always said, I wish the public could see some of these discussions and hear how we arrive at what we arrive at, because you get the end product of it. But Chris and I spend a lot of time sometimes talking about how we get to that end product. And sometimes it's just a matter of Chris saying to me, if you say this, you're going to get some trouble for it. And are you ready for that trouble? If you are, and you're prepared to get into that battle, go for it. If you'd like a different way of approaching this, here's my suggestion. So you're going to love hearing from Chris, because that's the part of the sausage being made that the viewers don't ever see. Amna Nawaz this is a real thrill to have you. Amna is a veteran. She's an Emmy Award-winning reporter. She is the new co-anchor of PBS NewsHour. She's an NBC and MSNBC contributor. She is the first, this makes me very proud as a Muslim journalist, she's the first Muslim Pakistani-American and first-generation American to host a PBS flagship program. And that really matters a lot. And thank you for that. So Amna, thanks for joining us. Thanks to all of you for being here. I want to just jump into it right now, and I want to start with Chris, because Chris, you're the one of those of us on this panel, you're the one the participants and the attendees here don't get to see. You're the one the viewers don't get to see, and yet you're the one who loses, I think, the most sleep over our integrity. Right? It's called Standards and Practices, but really you are like the integrity protection unit at NBC. Can you tell me your elevator pitch about what it is you do, why you exist, and why people should care? Have I got Chris?
Sorry, can you hear me now? I learned the mute button. Sure. I mean, standards basically, standards sounds sort of a dry word, but it's basically the standards of our journalism to make sure that our journalism is as high as possible in terms of its quality, excellence, accuracy, reliability, and overall credibility, so that we can preserve our reputation so that viewers and online readers and whatever format you are using to consume our news coverage, you have reason to trust us, and that we're doing everything we can to ensure that. So standards, we focus primarily on three principles, I would say, which are accuracy, fairness, and transparency. Just to boil it down kind of clearly, accuracy sort of speaks for itself. We spend in standards a lot of time, our team, Ali was mentioning, we spend a lot of time asking people, very veteran reporters, excellent reporters, Brandy, and we will often ask, well, how do you know this? Let's make sure, have we reached out here or there? We're sort of the gut check people, I think, in the background who just sort of come at a script or written story from a different perspective to make sure that the reporting is absolutely sound. And that's as far as the accuracy. As far as the fairness, we don't use the term balanced reporting, which I think is an important point here, because my background is in investigative work for many years, and there really is, balance sort of suggests it's a 50-50 dynamic, right? And it isn't always. When something is clearly wrong, I sometimes use the example of a convicted serial killer, right? I mean, you've got a convicted serial killer. We don't view that we have to spend 50% of the story explaining why he had a bad childhood, right? So it is a question where are we being fair? If there is some aspect of a story that needs to be represented, we in standards try to make sure that it is represented. Investigative stories are very similar. I never did a single story in my career where it was about something that wasn't clearly a problem, right? So you set out, it's obviously you recognize there is an issue here, or you wouldn't be doing the story in the first place. But we've got to be fair. We got to nail down not only the points about the story, but to be sure that we are understanding not only the perspective of those who may not end up looking good in the story, but we give them a fair shake at explaining or themselves or providing additional information that we may not know. So we try to be open-minded. We can't go into stories assuming that we have a complete grasp of all knowledge. So that's, again, partly what standards does is, hey, let's take a beat here and figure out whether there may be bits or pieces of information that are missing. And the last really core principle is transparency, which is just being clear with our viewers and our readers that we don't know everything. Sometimes we have to explain that. Sometimes we have to report on occasion on our own company, our owner, Comcast, which owns NBC News. We hold it to the same standards of coverage that we would any other news organization or any other company, rather. We want people who are watching us or reading us to understand that. And when we are, particularly when we are covering sort of breaking news or developing news where it's a little foggy, we want to make sure that we are being very clear and accurate about what we know and don't yet know. And in the context of sort of misinformation, I think all of these things apply. It's sort of a general open-mindedness. Some things are clearly wrong. We know they're wrong. And it's our job to report that. But it is also our job to be open-minded. What are we missing here? What other aspects of the story might be worth digging out or investigating? So that's I don't know if that answers your question, Ali.
No, it does. It really does. Thank you for that, Chris. And by the way, Alexa has put into the chat the 7 standards of quality journalism. We're going to do that throughout this conversation, where we're going to add links to things. Now I want to bring you in, and I want to combine this with a question that John Phillips has asked. He says, with the extreme nature, the polarization of our politics, how do you find the balance, a word that Chris just used? How do you suggest we do that with our students? I ask you this, not because you and I have showed up at the same things. We cover the same kinds of stories. I am sometimes there as a reporter. I'm sometimes there as the host of a show in which I express opinion, but we're covering the same things. How do you deal with that polarization? How do you deal with the fact that someone in a story either might be lying to you or is representing a point of view that you're going to have difficulty giving equal weight to? How do you think about those things?
Ali, it's such a great question. And first, let me say, I'm so excited to be here and happy to be here with journalists that I adore and look up to and whose work I am a fan of. So thank you for that. I think, and I should point out, the last time Ali and I saw each other in the field, it was in Texas, right? We were covering Uvalde. And we have this discussion oftentimes in our coverage, and I just had it again in Monterey Park where I was covering over the weekend, when we decide who to give time to and which views to give platform to when we're covering gun violence in America. Here's where kind of three core principles come to mind. One, curiosity, the other, skepticism, and the third, a fidelity to the facts. Fidelity to the facts overrides everything else for me. Like if I don't know it to be true, I cannot report it to our audience. The curiosity side of it is going into conversations expecting to learn something, right? Not thinking you already assume and you know what the other person's going to be saying. And the skepticism part is treating everybody's statements and answers with the same degree of skepticism and rigor. So questioning, how do you know? Why do you believe that to be true? What evidence do you have of that? Now, when it comes to gun, I'll just give this one example because I think it is so key and it's fresh in my mind. When it comes to gun violence in America, there are a few facts, right? That we are the only developed nation that deals with the problem at this level, that the numbers are what they are, that Congress has failed up until last year to pass any meaningful sort of gun safety reform, and even last year in a bipartisan, really limited way, and that this continues to happen. Right? We continue to have episodes of mass gun violence. We continue to have everyday gun violence. Suicides continue to be the leading cause of gun violence, or the leading form in which gun violence takes place. Those are the facts that underlie all the conversations. Now, coming back from Monterey Park, I can't tell you the amount of criticism I got online and in comments of people saying you are advocating for gun reform by giving platform to these people. And I will tell you, when it comes to partisan, bias of any kind, I don't have it. Never identified with any political party in America. Like I'm there as a journalist first and foremost. But when it comes to humanity and it comes to decency, I will always come down on the side of humanity and decency. So that informs my questions, right? And I think sometimes there's an assumption of bias. People will say, well, you support these policies, you're advocating for these policies, and I'm not. I'm asking questions about them, and I'm trying to get answers, and I will always be transparent with the audience about why I'm asking the questions I'm asking. These are the facts underpinning this question. This is how I know what I'm reporting to you and how I know it's true. And I think especially these days, our audience expects that. To build that level of trust, they need that level of transparency.
I love that. Thank you. And you do a great job of it. Hallie Jackson, you have an interesting position in our own operation in that you have a presence on NBC News and News Now. You have a presence on MSNBC. You report for all of our platforms. And the audiences from these places have different expectations of what the reporting will look like. And they some of our audience on MSNBC is looking for a degree of advocacy and opinion, and our audience on NBC News isn't, and yet you are the same person. You're the person we go to through the course of a day for reporting and for your own hosting. How do you manage the fact that people have different expectations, but you've got to be the same Hallie Jackson who's held up to the same standards all the time?
I don't manage it, right? Because it's not my problem what people see me as, right? And let me just say too, I have to say, Amna and Brandy, obsessed with you both. Ali, love you. Chris Scholl and I have had many conversations about stories and scripts. Hey, I think this line should be in. And Chris says, well, how do you know? So I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. For me, it's interesting because let's be real talk, super plain English. If you know me, you know that's a thing that I like to do. Our MSNBC audience is different from our network audience because that is an audience that sees Morning Joe in the mornings. They see Nicole and Ari and Chris and Joy and Rachel and Alex and Lawrence and Ali at night and Stephanie, and they expect it is intentionally a perspective programmed block in those hours, in the morning and in the evening. we know internally in our building that from 10 a.m. until 4 p.m., it is something called MSNBC reports, which is it is our hard news. It is powered, we say this all the time, but I believe it in my core, it is powered by the journalism that NBC News does. At the 3 o'clock hour, which I will anchor for the next few weeks, we have 12 to 13 to 15 correspondents from NBC News giving the journalism that they have, right? Courtney Kuby, Somalia, like whatever is breaking in the last 24 hours, she's on at the Pentagon immediately, right? We are the hard news engine for MSNBC. Now the audience, also sees MSNBC as a brand that has those different perspectives, which is not what I do. That is not what I do between 3 and 4, right? That is not what the mission of MSNBC reports is. So when Amna talks about she gets a lot of criticism coming back from Monterey Park, boy, don't read the comments, don't read the tweets, right? Because I get it. Well, why aren't you, I've had people tweet at me like, why aren't you being an advocate for X? I am not an advocate. I'm a journalist. And so, and Ali, when you ask that question, how do you manage that? Like, I can't, because it's not my problem to manage. And I don't mean that in a harsh way, because what I can do is hold myself accountable to the standards that NBC News has set, right? Meaning, what is the journalism? What do we know? What is sort of urgent and happening now? And who are the people who are the best voices to talk about this? I'll put Tom Winter up on his reporting any day, right? Like those are the voices that we're putting out there. Who's in the field? Where's Antonia Hilton in Memphis, right? Like these are the conversations we're having today. Those are the same conversations that I'm having on NBC News Now. It's the same conversation that I'll bring as far as when I wear my reporter hat on the Today Show or Nightly News. That's all the same, right? That's all, I'm powered by that same little engine. How people view that, that's not up to me. And it's hard, right? Like it's really hard because you who doesn't read the tweets? Who doesn't look at but you kind of have to set that aside a little bit because I think the most important thing, Al, you called it the integrity protection unit. I love that so much because if we don't have that, how can I go on and do a crosstalk, a bit of analysis for the Today Show on something if I don't feel good about the way that I've held myself to a certain standard, even if that means, some audiences don't like it.
That's kind of funny because I tell people when they say, how can you say these things and they must be lies? And I brag about Chris and standards and practices. And I bet you Chris is sitting here saying, wow, it's great you brag about me because every time I call you, you argue with me and you push back on everything I say and you don't want to do those things. But all of a sudden, I'm defending your honor as a journalist. You say don't read the tweets. And boy, am I guilty of that one. I read all this stuff and then I get worked up about it. But Brandy, you live in that world. Your entire world is about social media and internet and people who say crazy, nasty things all the time, including to you and about you. And I've seen once in a while you get into it. Most times I think you avoid it. But around the world, whether it's governments or nasty people or trolls, they are trying to frighten journalists. They're trying to cause us to back down. They're trying to put pressure on us when we try and hold power to account. I believe you face this more than any of us do.
Maybe. Yeah, no, it's awful. It's really, truly awful. Like, I mean, I'm a nice person. I don't get into arguments with people. I'm not like a fighty person. I have 3 small children. I'm like a mom. I think I give off mom vibes, and so many people just hate me because I report on things that are really hot button issues online, right? And so, I think the thing for me has been, it's been sort of hard. So like on the screen right now, you're seeing 2 stories that you can probably understand why it gets people so hot and bothered, the stuff I write about. The first one, I wrote this story with some of my colleagues about this lie that was traveling throughout the country, really. We found 20 elected politicians were forwarding this lie. Joe Rogan was doing it, that claiming that trans kids or kids were identifying as cats and animals and that they had litter boxes. On its face, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard, right? Obviously, that's not happening. Kids don't even, teachers and librarians here know, kids don't even want to go to the school bathroom. Nobody is dropping trow and going in a litter box. Like, it's just sort of trans panic. And so we traced that and we did the journalism. And, I think part of what you were saying earlier, it's so important. We have to show every single bit of our work. It has to be so bulletproof because people are so sort of mad about these issues. The next story was this, I've been sort of tracking this call of, satanic pedophiles have been just all in the news lately. We've been using it, politicians are using it as a political cudgel. Librarians are being told that they are, satanic groomers because they're putting LGBTQ books in the hands of kids. It's just really tough out there. And, I think the lesson that if any, that I've garnered from all of this is that you just have to really keep your head down and carry on. And, I'm so happy to be in this panel. I am a former teacher and librarian, and I'm just so energized and so sad that librarians are often on the forefront of these sort of political issues, right? But I'm just so sad that this is happening, and I'm so proud of all of you. And if I can just make a little plug, if anything's happening in your libraries or in your schools that you think is important, especially in this sort of culture war fight, my DMs are open on Twitter. It'd be nice to get something nice instead of the other stuff that I get. So please DM me.
And we do a banned book club every week, the Velshi Banned Book Club. So we're always looking for suggestions from both teachers and librarians about things that you're either challenged by or that you really think are important to cover. So that's what's called mystory@velshi.com. You can email us there and send us that information. I got a question, Hallie, that I want to ask you, and I want to actually play for everybody who's here a clip of you asking someone. The question is this: how can journalists hold politicians more accountable? Is it frustrating to see right and left being allowed to spew talking points? Do journalists worry about accessibility if they don't play ball? This is relevant to you because you are in the halls of power when you report. Here's one particular instance where you were holding someone accountable. Let's play this.
When was the president's last negative test prior to his diagnosis?
So we don't have that, but we're looking at this from a public health perspective, in that when there's an indication of a positive test or symptoms showing, then you go back the 48 hours, you do your contact tracing.
You are not saying when the president's last negative test was. Let's be clear about that. But let me ask someone else.
But the president was socially distanced from people. Certainly, you focused a lot on the New Jersey event. Everybody there said he was never within 6 feet of anybody.
Brian, we have video. We know the president wasn't socially distanced from everybody.
But
that's not true. We've seen video of the president over the weekend, Brian. We have eyeballs.
All right, Hallie, tell us about that.
Yeah, listen. It is. I think the journey that we've all had over the last 6 years or so with sort of in the world of politics, and even before that, has been an interesting one. So in this particular instance, this was one, and I had that was Brian Morgenstern, who was part of the comms press team at the White House under then President Trump, and this was a really critical moment. The backdrop to this is the president at the time got COVID, you know what I mean? And the White House was not being fully transparent about it. I mean, this was around when he was at Walter Reed, the whole 9 yards. And so there was a real question at this time when this happened. It must have been, I guess, 2020. I was at my home studio, so it was pandemic era, obviously. Was well, what is the timeline? And the White House was simply not being transparent or forthcoming about that. And so they were putting officials like Brian out to talk about it. And there is, I think, an assumption or an obligation on the part of the White House, right, or any stat, Capitol Hill office, whatever, that if you're going to put somebody out to talk about it, they should have some answers for the press that is pressing them on some of these questions. So that was a moment where we had a very specific thing in mind. We needed to get this single piece of information, which was, when was the then President Trump's last negative test? It had been asked in briefings, it had been asked on the driveway, it had been asked over and over again. Nobody could get a clear answer. And so sort of we intentionally went into this conversation hey, we just got to get at this question. And we never got there. We never got an answer on that. And sometimes that is going to happen. And so we have to make the call, how many times do you ask the question? When does it become badgering, right? When is it clear that this is not going to be a useful, productive conversation in that way? And you balance that with what is the value of having somebody on who cannot answer that question? Now, we don't go into the assumption that they cannot answer that question. The assumption is you work at the White House. You are being put out to answer questions. The assumption is that you have some knowledge to share, right? And that you're not just coming on to spin or whatever the case may be. So So that was sort of the context and the backdrop for that incident. And then there's the other piece of it, which is just being like an active listener, because, and I don't like, I very candidly, I think there are some folks and shows and broadcasts, which is totally their prerogative, that sort of like to have some of these interactions where you know it's going to be contentious going in. I am of a mind where I am not sure how productive that is to an audience, of confrontation for the sake of confrontation. That to me is not super interesting, right? And so that is just a sort of thing that is always in my mind when we're thinking about who do we bring on. We're very, very intentional about, do we have the right voice for this? Is this the right person to ask this question to? Because we don't just want to fill time. It's easy to book guests and newsmakers and whatever. That's not relevant always, right? And so that was very intentional in this moment. And so when Brian said, and listen, again, this is somebody who I've seen in the White House many times, upper press, and had those conversations with. When he says, well, the president was socially distancing, he actually wasn't. And like everybody saw it. And you can't, it's always a thing of like, how much do you interrupt? But like that felt just like an egregious obvious. That wasn't like, oh, well, I have reporting that he wasn't socially distanced. That was like dude, like we all watched it. You know what I mean? Like
the bear witness part though, right? That's the part where either you saw the video or we had cameras there or someone had a camera there or Amna was at the event. That's actually why half of our job, in order to hold people to account, you have to have borne witness. You have to know that video existed and you know a fact that was contrary to what the person you were interviewing is telling you.
And to the point that you're making here, I do think if you know that somebody's going to come on and all you're going to do is fact check them for 6 minutes, like to me, everybody's going to have to be thrown into, is that relevant and valuable?
Yes, right. And people ask me about that. Why don't you just interrupt every 2 seconds? And I said, well, because then there's no discussion. It would be better not to have the guest on. And then there's a question of, is it better not to have the guest on? This is a constant issue that we've got. Jonah has a question, and I want to put it to you, Amna. Years ago when I was at CNN, there were shark attacks and we reported a shark attack. And then suddenly we were reporting shark attacks every few weeks. And somebody said to me, are there a lot of shark attacks, or you just discovered that that you've just decided this is the thing that you report on? And then a couple of years later, it was helicopter crashes. We just talked about helicopter crashes all the time. So Jonah says, how do you think about the way factually accurate reporting can at times contribute to false perceptions of reality? For instance, when there's a huge increase in reporting on individual crimes, each article of which is fact-checked and accurate, but which does not correspond to an increase in crime rates. Same for reporting on vaccine complications. Talk to me about things like that. How do you think about these things when we report on them? And some of them are interesting because shootings, which you and I both cover a lot of, they're actually real. We cover a very small proportion of the mass shootings that occurred. So far this year, there's been more than one every day, mass shootings. So tell me about how we think about perceptions that we create about something that's happening versus the accuracy in individual stories.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you, Jonah. First, can I just give it up for the persistence and hero worship of Hallie? It's just like, this is what it's all about.
I appreciate that. Can I just jump in quickly? Because somebody said, well, what about the other side of the aisle? And because it wasn't just, and I wanted to say to that person, look at what's happening in the briefing room. And Amna knows this and Brandy knows this right now as it relates to the classified documents the president home. If you watch those briefings, those reporters, and I don't cover the White House anymore, but they are being just as persistent on, well, wait a second, when did you know? Why didn't you tell us? What about this date? Why did so I don't want to give the impression that it's one-sided and that was a specific question.
Thank you. That's right. Point. That's right.
Yes.
Thank you.
To your question. So I will point out in the interest of pulling the curtain back, and I know this happens at NBC for sure, where I grew up and spent many years as a correspondent as well, but definitely here at the NewsHour as well. We have very rigorous conversations about what we cover, like where to put our resources before we even talk about how to cover it. And that's important because on any given day, there are hundreds and hundreds of stories that could easily make the broadcast, right? Or we could put out on our social and digital channels. And we have to figure out, how do we curate down all of these stories into the most important stories, what we and our team believe are the most important stories for the American public to know about. And sometimes it's very different at 6 o'clock before we go to the air than it was at 9 o'clock that morning, and that's okay. But to the point of like how much attention we give something, We weigh that very heavily because you want to be able to answer people's questions. You want to meet them where their concerns are. If people have questions about vaccine complications, we want to be able to put facts into that void because there's a lot of bad information out there too. And we have to recognize we're competing for attention in a very noisy and messy landscape. I am personally of the mind that ignoring the bad information doesn't make it go away. And I think sometimes we have to address that stuff head on to say, we know this information is out there. Here's what you may be hearing. Here is an expert. We're going to put some tough questions to answer those questions so you are empowered with the facts. I also abide by what I call the truth sandwich. So bad information has to be addressed. You're going to hear it on our air because we're not going to ignore it, but we're going to start with what we know to be true. We're going to tell you why we're addressing the bad information, and we're going to end again with what we know to be true. So the overwhelming volume of information that you're getting is factually correct, but we're still addressing the bad information. And this is something we have to do all the time, right? Because we live in an era of a lot of misinformation, active disinformation campaigns, a lot of whataboutism when it gets into political discourse. And those truth sandwiches, just as like a very simple principle for me, get me through a lot of those tough spots.
I'm going to thank you for that. Andrew has a question. Brandy, I want to ask you, I know Amnika has put a response in the Q&A, but a lot of the stories you cover are by their very nature sensationalistic because they're based on conspiracy theories or lies or things that are spreading around the internet with remarkable velocity. And we know that bad stuff or sensational stuff spreads faster than true stuff and facts. Andrew says the presentation of a news story, the headlines, the page layout, and the graphics, because you put up a couple stories a while ago, frequently presents a bias that may not be in the content of the story. Take a look at the front page of MSNBC Now, not an unbiased image choice. How do you account for this? How much do financial concerns affect the presentation of news stories? Does the need for clicks cause a bias? And I think Andrew's talking about in the placement, the headlines, the page layout, and the graphics, which I think is a fantastic question, because we never put a headline up without hoping someone will actually see that headline. But I'm guilty of seeing a headline and thinking I know the story without having opened it or read it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Like I used to work at the Daily Beast, and it's more of a tabloid, right? And so, yes, like I would
great
say
headlines.
Yeah, so good. I mean, I'm a tabloid girl anyway, so like I sort of like that, but it's very different from sort of where I work now. We don't, believe it or not, like the idea of doing something for clicks is just not something we do. We actually, people don't know this, but I measure my stories not by how many people clicked on it, but by time on the page. And basically that is how did someone read the whole thing, right? Did I get someone to actually read the whole thing? So that's what we want. In terms of like the process for headlines and images, it's actually, it's collaborative. Just like people don't understand that, you know, when I have a story, I pitch a story to an editor and then I write the story and then I meet with my editor and he edits it and then it goes to standards and then it goes to legal. And there's all these barriers in place and guardrails in place to make sure that we know what we know and we can prove it. And then when we meet with editors, you know, we actually talk about the images that we're seeing. So like in this Satan photo or the Satan illustration, we actually talked a lot about who would be writing the demon here, and we had it first as like a woman. We're like, well, are we saying that that looks like Marjorie Taylor Greene? Is that unfair? So like we really do actually work quite a lot to make sure that every single piece of these things is fair. And I do think that idea of like clickbait, I think it's a little bit of an outdated model, actually.
Thank you for that. Chris, I sort of want to ask you a question that someone's put into the chat about, I've sort of lost it at the moment, but the question is, what do people misunderstand about journalism, and what are you doing, and I think you means us, to help people better understand how you do your job? And obviously this is part of it, what we're doing right now, but we've got a limited audience here. What is it that we can do in the course of doing our job that actually helps people understand what good journalism is and how we do it, other than just the product, right? I think some of us would argue the product is what should prove to people that it's good, but we live in an era where that's not always the complete story.
Yeah, I mean, I do think that obviously what we output needs to stand on its own. Every story we do needs to stand on its own, be accurate, fair, and responsible in every way possible. So the product itself, if you want to call it a product, is sort of the starting point there. But I think people have, in general, I mean, I've been doing this for a long time, and I think that in general, people don't have a very clear understanding of the efforts that go into accuracy in our news reporting, and just how much it means, frankly, to journalists as a species, right? We really care about these things. It's my job to sit here and kind of make sure we're accurate and drive those questions. But I can't think of a journalist in all of my career who just says, "Oh, I don't care." These
Right.
things really are values that matter to us as journalists. Sticking up for our reporting, making sure we're right. These things drive our journalism from the foundation. I think it is shared among everybody who decides to become a journalist in the first place. So I think that there is sort of I guess what I would say is a kind of a movie version of what it means to be a journalist. Often movies are, they don't cast us particularly well. I think that in my opinion, and this is just my biased opinion, I happen to think journalists are some of the finest people I know. I think they care about what they're doing. They work very hard, often risking their lives, sometimes, unfortunately, tragically, sometimes losing their lives, trying to uncover and report things to a world that desperately needs that information. I do think that for people who are outside the journalism world, the news consumers of the world, it becomes difficult at times in a world in which we now have so many sources of information, but not necessarily journalism. It becomes difficult to know what you're looking at. And I always suggest to people that they sort of apply the same standards that we do when we're evaluating things we see on Twitter or things we even see on the New York Times or any other, whatever external source we are viewing. We look for the same things. Where is this information coming from? Is the person that is providing this information clearly described? Or were they in a position to know what they are talking about? You kind of have to bring, I think, the same level of judgment as a news consumer that we do as journalists when trying to vet stuff, to determine whether or not what you are looking at is something you can rely on.
I want to ask you about, when we were coming up in this business, there was sort of an understanding. If you reported on a crime, or I was a business reporter, and you talked to a CEO or a company, we used to have, I think, less sophisticated views about whether people would lie to our faces with our cameras on. Maybe they were lying to us, or maybe they weren't. Maybe, and if you called a company up, or you called somebody up and told them that they had said something, or you called them out in an interview, often there'd be an apology, a correction. Their press secretary would call and say something. We're in a world now where people in authority will lie to our faces about something. And by the way, it occurs in these police brutality stories, right? It was always a story that we were told by authorities until video footage started showing up. And it's like, that's actually not how it all unfolded. How do you deal with that? Because we used to have trusted sources of information where, generally speaking, we ascribed a certain amount of value to the fact that the police told you this, the politician told you this, the congressman told you this. I don't know. Does that still exist in this world? Can we take anybody's statements at face value anymore?
This is a really big picture question, and it's something we really struggle with, I think, as an institution ourselves, as representing the Institute of Journalism, which is in and of itself in this country an institution of power. I think we have to view it that way, right? We have certainly seen an evolution. The police brutality example is a prime one, because for generations, you waited to get the official police response. That's what was reported first, and that was the standard by which you reported the entire story. The onus was then put to everybody else to prove that it wasn't true what the police or the institution was saying. With the advent of everyone being a journalist, essentially, with their own cameras and ability to report in real time and share information more widely than many of us, with body cameras with a lot more access to firsthand information and the ability to bear witness in a more intimate way, all of that has changed. I think we all doubt institutions at a new level and in a new way and much more broadly. Politically, I think that's certainly true, right? And maybe the argument can be made we should have been doing that all along. In the end, I think it's up to us as journalists to meet the moment. This is where we are. Maybe we do begin with an assumption of skepticism across all of these institutions, whether you're talking about financial executives or politicians and lawmakers or law enforcement or, pharma executives, whatever it is. I think we have to begin with the onus on the person in the position of power to prove what they are saying to us is true. And Hallie's right. You see this in the White House all the time now. When someone presents something, you hear a lot of pushback. Well, how do you know that? Can you show us that? Are you going to put out the numbers? I think journalists have risen to meet that moment in a way that we didn't necessarily have to before, maybe because the environment didn't necessarily demand it. I mean, the information and media environment didn't demand it, but we're there now. We still have a long way to go. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, but that's how I view that challenge right now, which is to say, it demands more of us. It makes us better journalists if we meet that moment.
It does demand more of us. Hallie, I know you got to run, and we're going to be finished in a few minutes anyway. But I have to ask you: when Brandy was saying she gives off mom vibes and she's a librarian, and that's exactly right. You are that great, engaging, funny person all the time. But when you were in the White House, you had to have these conversations that could get confrontational. You typically don't, but you are persistent. How do you manage that? How do you manage the idea that, hey, I think you're lying to me, or I think you're withholding information. It's my job to cover you. I'm going to be talking to you every day, but my viewer needs to see that I'm pressing you on this, but my viewer also needs to know I'm not being belligerent and I'm not being an ass about it. I'm actually just trying to get the story.
Yeah, and like not being an ass, kind of just a good life piece of advice, right? And I mean, it just generally, I think, is the move. And I think about that, right? It's respectful. Like it's still, whether or not, it is respect for the position and respect for, yourself and your industry as journalists. Part of it is, viewers see 30%, 40% of the interactions, but for most of the people that we cover, you are talking to them also, right? Like in other ways and in other possible. Like I think of, for example, the press briefings come to mind that Amna has mentioned here. To use this example in this current White House, which again, I don't cover, but Karine Jean-Pierre and her predecessor would hold, they have an office in upper press that journalists can walk up and into and knock on the door on, right? And you're having those conversations away from the cameras. And it's important to me, and I think a lot of people, that you got to be kind of the same person that you are off camera as on camera, right? Like I think there's sometimes this perception of certain folks where it's like the cameras turn on, then the show starts. Like I don't like that for us as an industry, right? And for us as people who hold people in power to account, because you got to be that human being. And so I think respect is a big part of it. I think the other piece, I was thinking and reflecting prior to joining this panel, Ali, when I was a baby correspondent for NBC News 10 years ago, and I was in LA, there was a big measles outbreak. And I think Brandy knows this well now because of what we've done through COVID and disinformation and misinformation. Remember, before COVID, it was measles that had a lot of misinformation around it. Right. And there was this big outbreak in California. I was at the LA Bureau, and we did like a month's worth of stories every day on Today and Nightly on this. And part of what we heard from experts and doctors was, you are not going to get people to understand why the measles vaccine is important by saying, wow, duh, you don't get it. Wow, you must be really dumb. Like shaming people doesn't work to help combat misinformation. And that was like something that was laid for me foundationally pretty early on. And it's so interesting how now, like 9 years later, that has so come full circle as it relates to politics, as it relates to the pandemic, and so much more.
Hallie, thank you. And I know you've got to run, so thank you for everything that you do. Chris, Mark put a question on the webinar chat, which I think was meant to be sarcastic or funny, but says this should be a show on TV. I actually wonder, should this kind of thing, not just with us, but should this conversation about pulling the curtain back on journalism at a time when journalism is imperiled and the integrity of the profession is imperiled, would it help people to not see the Hollywood dramatized version of it, but the actual gritty, difficult part of doing this? And would that help people gain trust? I mean, in most other companies, they don't put how the product is made out there. You buy the car and you like the car, and then you might buy the car again, or you buy the piece of clothing and you like the piece of clothing. But Could we benefit from these kind of frank conversations in front of the public?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. Again, I mean, to go back to what I said earlier, I really don't think people have a very good understanding. It's not their fault. It's just it's the nuance of any
Why would they?
profession, right? I mean, I know nothing about what a doctor is actually saying to me, what's going through his mind. But it's a similar kind of thing. We have a world in which we process information that and I think if people understood the difference between the way we do it in the NBC Universal News Group forum and other prominent news organizations do it versus what you might see, on Twitter, I think you would have a good basis for understanding the credibility of the journalism that's being done and whether or not it's accurate. I mean, we struggle. That's our daily struggle to be accurate. It's not to say we don't make mistakes. Everybody does, but we are trying hard. And so I think that kind of that kind of thing would be very valuable. I can't in my standards role really find a way to program that, but I would love to.
Putting it out in the ether right now. That's the idea.
Can I always say one thing, Ali, because I saw a comment earlier, which was following up on my point that journalists sometimes are risking their lives to bring news to the world, and somebody, I think it was Joel Hutchinson, I think if I got the name right, asked the question whether terms like fake news and news is the enemy of the people and that sort of thing make that make things more difficult or put people in danger. I really can't answer that. I can say that and this is not a comment in any political way or anything, but a term like fake news, which has become kind of, I mean, I've heard journalists use it, there really is no such thing. It's either fake or it's news. If it's not news, then it's fake, right? You can't have both. So it's purely as a logical term. I think that when that term is used, it really does blur the lines. It sort of suggests that what you're seeing in on NBC or MSNBC or reading in the New York Times or Washington Post is the same as what you might read in some of the forums that Brandy deals with. It's just either fake or it's news, and I just believe that as a journalist is very important to understand.
That is the note we've got to end on. There's so many amazing questions. There's so many amazing comments. Thanks to all of you who have participated in this. Thanks to my amazing panel, to Brandy, to Amna, to Chris, and to Hallie. I love this, and if they ever want to make a TV show on it, I hope that they'll invite me as a guest to participate. Thanks to all of you. I want to hand it back to Alexa to take the rest of it. Alexa.
Yes, thank you so much to all of the panelists for sharing your experiences and your expertise. I also support this, turning this into a TV show. And as I'm sure you've gathered from the chat and the Q&A, this was a really beneficial discussion for educators. At 1 Eastern, our next session with NBC Universal News Group will kick off. That webinar is going to be focused on how news organizations ensure that fair representation on air. It is in a different Zoom room, so please follow the link that's in your agenda. We'll also drop the agenda in the chat. And to our panelists, just one more time, thank you so much for spending your time with us. This was really, really incredible. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.